What is this? What am I looking at right now? An orc family? The daddy not wanting to go to war?
Must we go to war again?
No. 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 Orcs are beings bred for conquest and slaughter. That's simply what they are. Orcs are orcs. Orcs are orcs.
Math is math.
okay,
Math
Dad.
is math.
So, I see Amazon has learned absolutely nothing in the last 2 years. Let's briefly recap the first season's most glaring issues. Horrific pacing is a result of far too many plot lines, teleporting characters that destroyed the world's sense of scale, vaguely mystical dialogue that is trying way too hard to mimic Tolkien but just isn't any good at it.
Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot?
Incredibly basic character work, absolutely no respect for Tolkien's lore, and a noticeable lack of any of the themes that make Lord of the Rings so meaningful and timeless. Well, what if I were to tell you that Amazon looked at each and every one of those failures and decided to wholeheartedly double down on them? You're not the least bit surprised, are you? You expected this. We all expected this. So why did I even bother watching Rings of Power? After all, I've ignored plenty of very bad or even just mediocre shows that exist in some of my favorite fictional universes. Why is this one different? The answer is simple. It's Tolkien. Or rather, it claims to be Tolkien, which means something. You don't mess with Tolkien's legendarium. That is the epitome of fantasy, the greatest fictional story of the present age, if not of all time. If you make a Lord of the Rings adaptation, you'd better do your homework first, as my pal Omar puts it.
You come at the king, you best not miss.
When you screw with Tolkien's world, I am honor-bound to verbally lash your shoddy, ham-fisted, most expensive high school production ever, fan fiction, until its metaphorical back is redder than Sauron's eye. The Lord of the Rings is special. It matters. To think that this is possibly how some people will be introduced to Tolkien's world is unfathomable. Of course, Amazon doesn't exactly expect to be capturing a massive net new audience who is unfamiliar with The Lord of the Rings, as evidenced by this show constantly attempting to climb aboard the 20-year-old hype train of Peter Jackson's films. To be fair, that train is still going because those movies, for all their own flaws and inaccuracies, were largely true to the themes and morals of the original novel. Rings of Power, however, could hardly be less faithful to Tolkien's philosophy. Take, for example, this lovely moment where Círdan drops 2 of the elven rings of power, and one of them bounces quite purposefully to Galadriel. Yeah, I wonder where they got that idea. A ring that chooses its wearer? What a brilliantly unique idea. Someone get that writer a raise. Yes, this show is essentially treating the 3 elven rings as if they are the One Ring's light. The Diet One Rings are at the very center of this story. They are a source of major conflict between characters, and they are, apparently, so irresistibly beautiful that those who look upon them cannot help themselves, cannot take the step of actually destroying them by throwing them into the deepest sea trench known to Manwë?
On the seabed, a scar so deep its end none but Manwë himself knows.
Yes, the elves' master shipwright apparently doesn't know which Valar rules the sea. It's Ulmo, by the way. A quick Google search would have taught you that. But anyway, Círdan pulled a 180 as to the Diet Ring's fate upon looking at them, despite his earlier trust of Elrond's judgment, and then when the two speak again later, Círdan waxes poetic about the incredible power of the rings.
Look at the power they exert over every form of life.
I mean, what? Círdan sounds almost exactly like Boromir at the Council of Elrond, and he's one of the wisest of the elves? The thing is, though, he has to be right. Unless the show is completely discarding Tolkien's lore and making the 3 elven rings part of Sauron's design, which they absolutely never were. The 3 must be unsullied and their power uncorrupting. But then why have this moment where Círdan just has to look at the sugar-free One Rings and is so enamored by their supposed beauty that he completely changes his mind? He already knew the power granted by the 3. He was well aware that destroying them meant the elves would have to leave Middle-earth, according to this show, and was willing to destroy them anyway at Elrond's urging. And yet, The rings themselves overcame him. How can you watch that and not think that these rings are stained with evil? Círdan's attitude after he changes his mind is distinctly anti-Tolkien in its philosophy.
What is beauty when it is born in part of evil?
No less beautiful.
Yes, the origin of the power you wield matters. That is one of the main points of the Lord of the Rings. And yet, Círdan is completely enchanted by this ring that is so powerful that fish are willing to leap out of water just to be near it. He doesn't see a warning there?
Because I do.
Elrond's point of view regarding the One Ring's Coke Zero is the only logical one, if you ask me. Especially after Círdan's snip-snap.
Snip-snap, snip-snap, snip-snap!
And yet, according to the most basic of lore, Elrond has to be wrong about the rings. I don't know, maybe the show will dunk on the lore yet again and Elrond will have been right all along. Rings of Power is toying with the themes of the corrupting nature of power and the foolishness of trying to use evil to do good, because those are central elements of The Lord of the Rings. But they are completely misplaced in this show, since the Elven Rings are supposed to be undoubtedly beyond Sauron's influence, until he forges the One Ring, at which point all elves who wear a Ring of Power, not just the three, unmistakably and immediately sense his presence and influence and take off their rings. The rings are good, but Sauron, through the One Ring, can use them to corrupt their wearers. The elves, being the wisest of all creatures, could sense this impending corruption. Dwarves were somewhat resistant to it, and men fell prey to Sauron's designs relatively easily. It's all quite clear if you just read what Tolkien wrote. This introduction of murkiness regarding the Elven Rings is totally anti-Tolkien. This is what modern Hollywood does. It takes timeless stories about good and evil and says,
Are you sure about that?
It has no real answers, of course. It just wants to subvert your expectations for the sake of subversion. The elves aren't really the wisest and fairest of all beings, you see. They are instead gullible idiots who are just as vulnerable to the allure of power as the weakest of men. I mean, High King Cauliflower Ear doesn't even trust Galadriel to not be deceived by Sauron all over again. He has a whole conversation with her about how the deceiver can control one's very perception of reality once he has gained their trust. Which, what? May I ask for a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Yeah, sure, Sauron is an incredibly powerfully deceptive person, but do you know who the least likely person to be fooled by him would be? I'll give you a hint, Cauliflower Ear. She's standing right in front of you. Who would have more motivation to ensure she was never tricked again? Who would be more wary of every move he made? I mean, I'm pretty sure Galadriel wouldn't even enter into conversation with Sauron. She'd just go in dagger first, as well she should. What is this alter their very reality crap? Of course, this whole conversation only serves to move the plot forward, because the writers wanted Elrond to go to Eregion with Galadriel, and so they came up with an imaginary need for him to do so, and simply stuck with it. Now, it does make logical sense that Galadriel is insistent that she go face down Sauron. Hunting him has been her purpose from the first minute of this show, and after her humiliation last season, she should want to make up for her failure.
I alone can slay him.
For the second time in this scene, I must ask, why?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Right, sorry, I forgot that was our logic here. This dialogue would make way more sense if Galadriel said something along the lines of, I have to do this. I need to redeem myself. Which I suppose you could say is the subtext here if you're being generous, but really that's not what Galadriel is saying. She's not saying it has to be me in that her pride is driving her to be the one to take Sauron down, but rather it has to be me in that no one else physically could, which, how would she know that?
He knows my mind, and I know his.
Her wanting to face down Sauron in Eregion is perfectly logical, but the reasons they present here are external rather than internal, and that takes away from potential character work, and thus the potential theme of how pride drives us to recklessness. Now, you might be wondering, why are the elves so desperate to reach Eregion and save Celebrimbor? Surely Galadriel, after her discovery of Halbrand's true identity at the end of the first season, warned everyone she could, and made widely known the form Sauron had taken. Right? And thus Celebrimbor wouldn't do something so stupid, such as letting Sauron inside his inner sanctum. Right? Turns out Galadriel just told everyone do not treat with him, but didn't offer any other explanation for her sudden change of heart regarding Halbrand. Because what? She was ashamed of having been fooled? She feels so bad about being duped that she fails to warn all the other elves that Halbrand is actually the most powerful and evil being in Middle-earth. That is the explanation we're assumedly, because the show never actually tells or shows us, going with? Yeah, I don't buy it. Again, these are elves. They are supposed to be better than that. But the showrunners clearly do not know how to write elves, so they write them as if they were men, and incredibly stupid and flawed men at that. It's hard to imagine men falling prey to Sauron's lies any easier than Celebrimbor does, who watches Halbrand stand in the rain for all of 5 minutes, and then lets him into his forge. Why is Celebrimbor such a pushover? Would anyone like to explain this to me? Yeah, again, Sauron's the deceiver. But oh my gosh, he's barely even trying. He implies to Celebrimbor that the other elves are profiting off of his hard work, and then turns to leave in just the most obvious hard-to-get bit I've ever seen.
Where are you going? There's no cause to stay where I'm not wanted.
A 6-year-old child would see through this deception. At least he tries a little harder later, pulling his whole "I'm a messenger from the Valar" or whatever shtick, and promising Celebrimbor that he will be revered as
The Lord of the Rings.
Because, of course, they just had to sneak that in there. Very, very subtle. And this point might hit home better if we previously had any sense whatsoever of Celebrimbor's ambition. But again, as with most everyone in the show, he's hardly a character. Like High King Cauliflower Ear, he's just a plot device, there to create whatever totems or MacGuffins the story needs to keep crawling along. Have we before this been given any signs that Celebrimbor desired renown or the adoration of others? No. We're simply supposed to believe that he has, because Sauron suggests that he has, and that's that. And so powerful is this sudden and unexplained motivation of Celebrimbor's that he sends a letter to High King Cauliflower Ear lying about the forge, saying that he is closing it down because the 3 rings are complete, I guess? As if the elves won't have need for any other metalwork in the future. Yes, that is a truly believable lie coming from the mouth of a master smith. Again, how dumb are these elves? I might be inclined to be a little bit more forgiving of their stupidity and weak wills if they were men, but elves? No. Sorry. Can't do it. Celebrimbor doesn't show the slightest resistance to Sauron's influence, because we don't have time for that. We have 1,000 other plot lines to follow, and a million other characters that you don't care about to put on screen. Furthermore, we're supposed to believe that the wisest of all creatures are fooled by the same idiot who couldn't convince approximately 25 orcs to follow him. In Season 2's opening scene, Sauron tries to convince the orcs with this speech about his grand plans, when really he should just be assuming command as if he's Azula claiming her divine right to rule. Get in line or get turned into an orc pancake. There should be no question as to whether or not Sauron is in charge. Him getting assassinated because he trusts Adar with a spiky crown makes him look unbelievably weak. It undermines his status as the big bad guy, which is horrible enough from a writing standpoint and even more so from a thematic one, as this is supposed to be a story where good struggles against a seemingly unconquerable evil, not one that can be undone by a few measly orc knives. Not to mention there's yet more moral murkiness here, because apparently the orcs wanted to be free of Sauron for reasons.
My children, you are free.
Anyhow, after several centuries of being goo, Sauron leaves Middle-earth with some refugees from the orcs. Okay, so the orcs did want to pillage and murder, just not under Sauron? And he strikes up a burgeoning relationship with a wise old man, who delivers some actually decent dialogue about having to choose good over and over again. Do I detect a hint of a theme? That line is probably the truest of Tolkien's philosophy this show will ever come. Morgoth and Sauron are, in the lore, beings with free will who could choose to do good rather than to serve their own selfish ends. After Morgoth's first defeat and subsequent imprisonment, he is set free within Valinor, and the Valar themselves believe him to be reformed. The possibility of redemption is very real, but we all know that is not what Sauron chooses, of course. Still, I did like that the show presented this as a choice he makes, and not simply that his nature is unchangeably evil. At least to a point anyway. The point of no return probably happens around when he forges the One Ring, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I can say with absolute confidence that the Sauron in The Lord of the Rings is unquestionably and undeniably evil through and through. But you know who is not 100% pure evil? The orcs, according to this show. I'm referring in particular to this apparent lieutenant of Adar's who has shown up a few times and who is decidedly afraid of Sauron returning, and wouldn't you know it, Also anti-war.
Must we go to war again?
Yes, this orc is portrayed as a loving father who doesn't want to go off to fight. He wants to stay home for the sake of his orc wife and orc baby. Do I need to explain how messed up this is? I'm guessing you don't need to hear it, but just in case someone does, these are orcs. They are evil. They are bred for war. They fight, they die. That is their life cycle. Yes, they do reproduce, but it's pretty safe to assume that them doing so is purely functional, an act commanded and controlled by their overlords because they want bigger armies. Did Tolkien struggle with the idea of orcs being pure evil beyond redemption, with the idea that they seem to have wills, and yet those wills might not be totally free after their initial corruption by Morgoth? Yes, he did, but guess what? He still wrote them as evil with no redeeming qualities. That is simply how they are in the books. In Return of the King, Frodo and Sam witness two orcs fight to the death over a minor insult, and Frodo remarks how he has heard that the orcs have always been that way. This attitude of, oh, well, the bad guys might not actually be that bad, is just plain silly and a little evil itself, and deserves to be mocked into oblivion. This is a fantasy story about good versus evil. Yes, the good guys may struggle with right and wrong at times, but there's no question as to the despicableness of the forces of Mordor. If we're talking about other men, such as the Easterlings or Haradrim, then we can absolutely talk about moral struggles, and whether or not the man at the receiving end of your arrow is in fact 100% deserving of his untimely end. Sam ponders such questions when he witnesses a dead Haradrim, a sentiment given to Faramir in the movie. But we are not talking about men now. These are orcs. They are made for war, fighting, and killing. End of discussion. If you want to talk about characters who could legitimately struggle with questions of purpose, then let's discuss the Numenorians. When last we saw them, Isildur was missing, presumed dead, and now his horse is refusing to sail back from Middle-earth to Numenor, even though his own father is totally cool leaving. Elendil should be turning over every stone within a 50 square mile of that crappy little town where they had that crappy little battle against those crappy little orcs. But nah, he's packed up and ready to leave his son's corpse to rot. What a great dad. Where's the character work? Where is the theme of a father's unstoppable love for his son? Does Elendil not care? Go with the horse, you idiot. Nope, can't have anyone doing anything so loving and heroic, apparently. Gotta move the plot forward, and the script says Isildur is alive and in the Black Forest, which only exists to get you excited for Shelob showing up. You remember Shelob, right? From those old movies you love so much, remember? Yes, Amazon, I am very excited for you to show me your vision of this giant, bulbous, spider-like being. After your attempt at wargs, I can only assume she'll end up looking like a worse version of a glyphid exploder. The Isildur scenes are fine. There's actual character work happening, which is a nice change of pace. Isildur reveals to this random chick whom he found in a wagon that his mother drowned in the act of saving his life, and he's never told anyone. He's just trying to make up for it. And her response is actually, dare I say, somewhat wise?
I don't know if you can earn a thing like that.
Every so often, you get little bits that actually feel like they belong in an adaptation of one of Tolkien's stories. And they're never the grandiose, pompous, barely sensical language that these Amazon elves like to use, but rather the small, simple bits of wisdom shared from one human to another. What's done is done. The guilt that Isildur feels is unnecessary. There is nothing he can do to make up for him accidentally causing his mother's death, other than to be the man she would want him to be. As always, the words of Kratos are ever applicable.
But what will you do now?
But I do have to ask, what is the point of all this? As happy as I am that there is some actual character work attempted, I don't yet see how it fits into the overall narrative. And that's the tricky bit, isn't it? Actually putting together that puzzle of characters and plot. Does Isildur overcome his pubescent internal struggle and become the man he is supposed to be? The man who slices the ring off of Sauron's finger? I'd be rather surprised if Amazon actually shows us a man of that level of strength and courage, to be honest. All the good guys in this show are just so meh. It's clear that only about 5% of the budget went into writing the characters, and the rest went toward the visuals. Numenor, of course, looks beautiful in its grandeur, a massive island nation that is now, upon the Queen's return, experiencing a power struggle as Pharazôn seeks to uproot Termariel. And, well, I don't care. There's a bare-bones plot about interventionist versus anti-interventionist, and Pharazôn is apparently the leader of the latter faction, which is hilarious, since he's the one who goes to Middle-earth and brings the captive Dark Lord back to Numenor, but whatever. Again, I ask, what is the theme here? Is the show trying to get at the burden of leadership? How making the right choice is better than making the popular one? Or is it just saying that you need to have someone start chanting your name first when a giant eagle shows up, because apparently that's how succession disputes get resolved here? I watched the show Succession not long ago, which managed to spend 4 whole seasons on a family fighting for the crown of an empire, and it was riveting the entire time because the characters actually had depth. Their relationships were complex and constantly evolving. They acted in surprising and shocking ways, and everyone else had to adapt. It's a brilliant show if you don't mind watching some of the absolute worst people be terrible people. It's a fantastic warning against the power of pride and greed and how those vices tear families apart. A thematic element that is actually somewhat present in Kaza Doom, where Durin the Fourth and Durin the Third are both refusing to apologize to one another after D3 disowned D4 during their argument over how to treat Elrond last season. And since D4 apparently never invested any of his salary when he was a prince, he's hard at work in the mines, being made fun of for getting blisters, which, what? Did the writers forget their own show? You know, the show that introduced D4 by showing him winning a stone smashing contest against Elrond. I mean, yeah, sure, he's a prince, haha, but more importantly, he's a dwarf. This is nothing but a stupid attempt to manufacture sympathy by having unnamed extras torment a named character out of sheer malice that's been conjured out of thin air. It's Baby Galadriel and the paper boat all over again. Stop trying to do this. Stop trying to make me like your characters by having other characters be unnecessarily and unrealistically mean and spiteful toward them. Dwarves, mine. It's literally what they do. Dwarves are dwarves. Dwarves are dwarves.
Math is math. Math is math.
Find another way to drive D4 to swallow his pride and talk to D3 other than him being picked on by the other dwarves who resent him for being a prince. Because of course, all working class people hate rich people according to Hollywood. The point of all this is to ham-fistedly show us that D4 is in a bad spot, and he could fix it if he would just swallow his pride and apologize to his father. I don't have any problem whatsoever with the theme of this plotline. The willingness to discard one's pride is superbly important, and having a character actually grow in humility or any virtue or trait is something this show badly needs. But the execution of it is told with all the deftness and subtlety of a dwarf from the perspective of an elf.
The dwarf breathes so loud we could have shot him in the dark.
And D4 does find the humility to apologize, eventually, after he presents Celebrimbor's offer to forge rings for the dwarves, which would help them fix the sun shafts they use to grow crops, which they can't do themselves because they
Can't hear the mountains anymore.
Why, you ask? Well, according to Disa, it has something to do with D3 and D4 no longer speaking to each other, and that's literally the only explanation we get. Anyhow, now that D3 and D4 have reconciled, they can hear the mountain again, right? So there's no need for Celebrimbor's rings, right? I mean, D4 even warns D3, who has been staunchly and persistently against elven involvement in dwarvish affairs, that he doesn't trust the rings which are being offered to them. So naturally, the next thing we see is D3 in Eregion, handing over their most precious metal to an elf. Again, character motivations just go
Snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap.
Why would this incredibly stubborn anti-elf dwarven king suddenly, against the advice of his own son who has just come to him and apologized, decide that their only option is the elven rings? Did you even try mining again? Can you hear the mountain? Or is that mystical ability completely dead for some other unexplained and highly convenient reason? Nope. Sorry, no time for questions. We gotta move the plot forward, and the plot says the dwarves get rings. And let me take this opportunity to express how much I detest the idea that the rings have to fix a specific problem. Oh, our tree is dying. Gotta get 3 mithril rings to save it. We can't hear the mountain anymore. Surely 7 mithril rings will do the trick. The setups for the rings are just shoved into the story so that the rings can be created, and it all feels so forced. It feels like the writers wrote these specific endpoints. Rings get forged, Numenorian throne gets seized, etc., and then didn't plan out any of the steps in between. Just made it up as they went along. This is why we don't get any good themes or messages from this story. They didn't write any. Themes need to be central to a narrative, the character arcs reflecting those themes as they progress through the plot. That simply isn't the case here. The showrunners plucked some notable plot points from Tolkien's lore, which they wanted to include, and then haphazardly stitched them together, characters changing simply as the narrative demanded. There are tiny glimmers of some good thematic elements, the ever-present possibility of change, the necessity of forgiving yourself and not trying to earn redemption through your actions, and how pride hampers growth and healing. But those only appear momentarily and are hardly ever built on, because there simply was no plan for them to happen. They just happened, flashes in the pan quickly forgotten. Sam, aren't you forgetting the rings? Surely the dangerous allure of power they present is core to Tolkien's philosophy. Yeah, of course, but someone should tell the elves that, because they seem to think that power is all well and good. Galadriel feels it in her heart that the rings are okay to use, guys, so let's not worry about corruption or anything. Círdan is totally chill with these rings being super powerful, exerting their power over every living creature, regardless of their origin, because they're going to use them for good. Right, yeah, that's very Tolkien. Or you could say there's the theme of how bad isn't all that bad. The poor orcs just want to be left alone. That's why they enslaved all those elves and murdered all those people in the first season. Yep, great lessons being taught by Amazon these days. This show doesn't have a philosophy or themes or morals. It's not telling us anything. It's not inspiring or uplifting, nor is it a cautionary tale. It's allegedly a story of good versus evil, but the good guys are a bunch of flip-flopping idiots and directionless morons, and the bad guys are either suggested to not be all that bad, or are so hilariously and cartoonishly evil that they put Dr. Doofenshmirtz to shame. I don't really have anyone to cheer for, except Isildur's horse. Bro is a real one.